the weaver of forgotten dreams. In the mountain village of Serenity's Edge, there lived a woman named Lumina Quietheart, who possessed an extraordinary gift that both blessed and burdened her restless soul. Each night, as the world settled into slumber, she could weave the forgotten dreams of others back into existence using threads spun from moonlight and morning dew. Lumina's cottage sat at the village's highest point, where ancient pine trees whispered secrets to the stars, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibilities. Her loom, carved from a single piece of sacred cedar, had been passed down through 7 generations of dream weavers, each leaving their own subtle magic woven into its very grain. The villagers below knew nothing of her nocturnal work. They saw only a solitary woman who kept to herself, tending a garden of night-blooming jasmine and collecting rainwater in crystal bowls. But what they didn't understand was that Lumina held the threads of their deepest healing within her gentle hands. Every evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Lumina would sit at her loom and close her eyes, allowing her consciousness to drift like smoke through the village below. She could sense the dreams that had been lost to worry, forgotten in the chaos of daily life, or abandoned when hope seemed too fragile to nurture. Tonight, her awareness settled on Marcus Stoneheart, the village blacksmith whose hands had grown rough not just from working iron, but from carrying burdens that belonged to his past. For months, Marcus had been unable to sleep peacefully, his mind churning with regrets, and his heart heavy with words left unspoken to his late father. Lumina's fingers began to move across her loom with the fluid grace of water finding its way through stone. She gathered threads of silver moonlight for forgiveness, golden strands of dawn for new beginnings, and deep blue fibers of night sky for the peace that comes from letting go. As she wove, the dream began to take shape, not in the physical realm, but in the space between sleeping and waking, where healing happens most naturally. In this dream, Marcus found himself in his father's workshop, not as it was in life, but as it existed in the realm of perfect understanding. The forge glowed with a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with love. His father, no longer bent with age or clouded by the misunderstandings that had separated them, stood beside the anvil with eyes that held only compassion. Through Lumina's weaving, father and son spoke the words that had been trapped in their hearts for years, not with voices, but with the deeper language of souls recognizing each other across the veil of time and regret. The hammer strikes on the anvil became a rhythm of healing, each blow releasing another layer of pain until only gratitude remained. Lumina worked through the night, her fingers dancing with the precision of someone who understood that dreams are not merely entertainment for the sleeping mind, but medicine for the wounded heart. She wove forgiveness into the very fabric of the vision, ensuring that when Marcus woke, he would carry this healing with him into his waking hours. As dawn approached, she could feel the dream settling into Marcus's sleeping consciousness like a gentle rain soaking into parched earth. His restless turning ceased, his breathing deepened, and, for the first time in months, his face relaxed into the expression of someone who had finally found peace. But Lumina's work was not finished. Her gift came with a price that few would understand. Each dream she wove for others drew from her own reservoir of rest. While she healed the sleep of the village, her own nights became filled with the gentle labor of love. She rose from her loom as the first light touched the mountain peaks, her hands tired but her heart full. Through her window she could see Marcus's cottage in the distance, and she knew that when he woke, he would carry a lightness in his step that had been absent for too long. The morning air carried the scent of pine and possibility as Lumina stepped into her garden. The night-blooming jasmine was closing its petals to rest, and the crystal bowls had collected fresh dew that sparkled like captured starlight. She gathered this essence carefully, knowing it would become tomorrow night's threads of healing. As she worked in her garden, Lumina felt the familiar tug of someone else's restless sleep calling to her. This time, it was Elena Whisperwind, the village librarian, whose dreams had been clouded by the fear of not being enough of her quiet contributions going unnoticed in a world that seemed to value only the loudest voices. Lumina smiled softly, already envisioning the tapestry she would weave that night. Threads of recognition for Elena's gentle wisdom, strands of validation for her quiet strength, and fibers of understanding that showed how the most powerful changes often happen in whispers rather than shouts. The sun climbed higher, and the village below began to stir with the activities of a new day. But Lumina knew that the real work of transformation happened in the quiet hours when the conscious mind stepped aside and allowed the deeper wisdom of dreams to do its healing work. She retreated to her cottage to rest, for even dream weavers need sleep, though hers came in small fragments between the calls of those who needed her gift. As she lay down on her simple bed, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the gentle energy of service, Lumina felt the satisfaction that comes from using one's gifts in service of others' healing. The afternoon sun streamed through her windows, casting patterns that looked almost like the very dreams she wove each night, shifting and dancing across the wooden floor in gentle hypnotic movements. In her half-sleep, Lumina dreamed of her grandmother, the previous dream weaver who had taught her that the art was not about controlling sleep, but about becoming so still that the natural healing wisdom of the universe could flow through her hands without obstruction. "Remember, little moonbeam," her grandmother's voice echoed from memory. "We do not create the dreams. We simply clear the tangles so that what needs to emerge can find its way to those who need it most." Hours passed in this peaceful state until the sun began its descent toward the mountains. Lumina woke naturally refreshed by the brief but deep rest that came to those who live in harmony with their purpose. She could already sense the stirrings of need from the village below, not urgent cries for help, but the gentle pull of souls ready for healing. As evening approached, she prepared her sacred space with the reverence of a monk preparing for meditation. Fresh water in the crystal bowls, newly gathered threads of moonlight arranged by color and intention, and the ancient loom cleaned and blessed with gratitude for another night of service. The first dream that called to her belonged to Thomas Gentlebrook, an elderly man whose wife had passed the previous spring. His sleep had been haunted not by nightmares, but by an emptiness so profound that even his dreams felt hollow. Lumina began weaving a vision of reconnection, not with his wife's physical presence, but with the eternal love that transcends the boundaries of life and death. In the dream she crafted, Thomas found himself in a garden that existed nowhere on earth but everywhere in the heart. His wife was there, not as a ghost or memory, but as the living embodiment of all the love they had shared. She showed him how their connection had not ended, but transformed, becoming part of the very fabric of his being. Through Lumina's careful weaving, Thomas experienced the profound truth that love never dies. It simply changes form, becoming the courage to live fully, the compassion to help others, and the wisdom to cherish each moment as the gift it truly is. As the night deepened, Lumina moved from one dream to another, each requiring its own unique combination of threads and intentions. For Maria Brightwater, the young mother, overwhelmed by the challenges of raising 3 children alone, she wove dreams of strength and recognition of her own remarkable resilience. For Samuel Quietstone, the merchant who had lost his way between ambition and contentment, she created visions of the simple joys he had overlooked in his pursuit of external success. The taste of morning tea, the sound of rain on his roof, the satisfaction of an honest day's work done with presence rather than pressure. Each dream she wove carried the same underlying message, though expressed in ways perfectly suited to each dreamer's needs, that peace is not a destination to reach, but a way of being. To remember that healing happens when we stop fighting our experience and start embracing it with gentle awareness. As dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pastels, Lumina completed her night's work with a dream for herself, a simple vision of continuity, of the endless cycle of giving and receiving that keeps the world in balance. In her own dream, she saw herself as part of an infinite chain of healers, stretching back through time and forward into futures yet to be born. She understood in that moment of perfect clarity that comes at the boundary between night and day that her individual efforts were both infinitely important and beautifully small, a single note in a symphony of healing that played constantly throughout the universe. The village below began to stir with the sounds of a new day, and Lumina knew that somewhere down there, Marcus was waking with lightness in his heart. Thomas was feeling connected to love again. Maria was recognizing her own strength, and Samuel was remembering what truly mattered. Story 2: The Keeper of Silent Hours. In the monastery of peaceful transitions, nestled in a valley, where time seemed to move at the pace of growing trees, there lived a monk named Brother Stellarium Moonwhisper, whose role was unlike any other in the sacred community. While his fellow monks tended gardens, copied manuscripts, or led morning prayers, Stellarium kept watch over the hours when most of the world slept. His cell was located in the highest tower of the monastery, where a single window faced each cardinal direction, allowing him to witness the complete journey of night across the sky. The walls were bare, except for a simple wooden chair, a meditation cushion worn smooth by decades of use, and a small bell that had been cast in silence and never rung. Stellarium's practice was deceptively simple: to remain awake and aware throughout the night hours, holding space for all those who struggled with sleep anxiety or the deep questions that emerge in darkness. He understood that insomnia was not merely a physical condition, but often a soul's way of seeking something that daylight consciousness could not provide. Each evening, as the last of the sunset faded from the western window, Stellarium would begin his vigil. He sat not in rigid meditation, but in a state of open awareness. His consciousness expanded like a gentle net that could sense the restless minds and troubled hearts within a 100-mile radius. Tonight his awareness was drawn to a city far from the monastery, where a woman named Isabella Stormheart paced her apartment floor at 3 in the morning, her mind spinning with worries about decisions that couldn't be made until daylight returned. She had been an executive for 15 years, accustomed to solving problems through action and analysis. But lately, sleep had become an enemy that evaded all her strategies. From his tower window, Stellarium could sense Isabella's frustration, the way her thoughts circled like water trapped in a drain. The tension in her shoulders that no amount of warm baths or herbal tea could ease, the deep exhaustion that somehow coexisted with an inability to rest. Without moving from his cushion, Stellarium began to extend what he called the practice of shared stillness. This was not prayer in any conventional sense, nor was it an attempt to send energy or healing across the distance. Instead, it was a profound act of companionship, a way of being present with someone's struggle without trying to fix or change it. As Isabella continued her restless pacing, something shifted in the quality of her solitude. She couldn't have explained what changed, but the apartment felt less empty, less echoing with the hollow sound of her own anxiety. Gradually, her steps slowed and she found herself drawn to the window where city lights twinkled like earth-bound stars. Stellarium sat with her invisible presence for hours, not interfering with her process, but simply offering the gift of witnessed solitude. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most healing thing is knowing that somewhere, someone is awake with you in the darkness, not trying to solve your problems, but simply acknowledging that difficulty is part of the human experience. As the night progressed, Isabella's frantic mental energy began to settle. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea and for the first time in weeks sat quietly without reaching for her phone or her laptop. In that stillness, she began to hear something beneath the noise of her worries, a deeper wisdom that had been trying to speak to her for months. Meanwhile, Stellarium's awareness expanded to encompass others whose sleep was troubled. There was David Gentlecurrent, a father of 2 who lay awake, calculating mortgage payments and college funds, his love for his family twisted into a knot of financial anxiety that robbed him of the peace he needed to be present with them. For David, Stellarium held the intention of trust. Not the naive belief that everything would work out perfectly, but the deeper trust that arises when one remembers that love itself is the greatest wealth, and that families who face challenges together often discover strengths they never knew they possessed. In another part of the city, elderly Mrs. Sophia Quietstream sat by her kitchen window, unable to sleep because the silence of her empty house felt too vast to bear since her husband's death 6 months earlier. The nights had become landscapes of memory and longing that seemed to stretch endlessly before dawn. Stellarium's presence touched her isolation with the gentlest acknowledgement. He understood that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a love with nowhere to go, and that sometimes the kindest response is simply to sit with someone in their missing without trying to fill the emptiness or rush the healing. Hours passed in this way, with Stellarium serving as a silent lighthouse for those lost in the dark waters of sleeplessness. His presence was like a steady flame that asked nothing of those who saw it, except perhaps to remember that darkness is temporary, and that dawn always comes even on the longest nights. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of approaching morning, Stellarium felt the shift note that always marked the end of his vigil. One by one, those he had been accompanying through the night began to find their way to rest, not because their problems had been solved, but because they had remembered that they were not alone in their struggle. Isabella finally crawled into bed just as the first birds began their morning songs, her body tired enough to override her mind's protests. David's breathing deepened as he realized that his love for his family was itself a form of abundance that no financial worry could diminish. Mrs. Sophia fell asleep in her kitchen chair, wrapped in a shawl, and the surprising comfort of knowing that someone somewhere understood the particular ache of loving someone who is no longer there to receive it. Stellarium rose from his cushion as the monastery bells began their call to morning prayer. His legs were stiff from the long night of sitting, but his heart was full with the satisfaction that comes from service without recognition or reward. Story 3. The Guardian of Threshold Dreams. At the edge of the waking world, where consciousness meets the mysterious realm of sleep, there existed a place that most people glimpsed only in the fleeting moments between alertness and slumber. Here lived Seraphina Driftweave, a guardian whose purpose was to tend the delicate transition that millions of souls made each night as they crossed from the daylight world into the healing embrace of dreams. Seraphina's dwelling was neither fully in the physical realm nor completely in the world of dreams, but existed in that liminal space where possibilities shimmer just beyond the reach of ordinary perception. Her home appeared to each visitor differently sometimes, as a cozy cabin with a fireplace that burned without consuming, sometimes as a garden pavilion surrounded by flowers that bloomed in colors that had no earthly names. The furnishings of her space were equally fluid. There was always a comfortable place to rest, always the perfect temperature, always the subtle scent of whatever brought each visitor the deepest sense of safety and peace. For some, it smelled like their grandmother's bread baking. For others, like rain on summer leaves or the ocean at dawn. Seraphina herself appeared as a woman of indeterminate age, whose presence radiated the profound calm that comes only to those who have learned to exist without resistance to the natural flow of change. Her hair seemed to be woven from twilight itself, shifting between dark and light as consciousness shifts between waking and sleeping. Tonight, as she had for countless centuries, Seraphina prepared to welcome those who struggled with the transition into sleep. Her work was essential, yet invisible, for she served as a bridge for minds that had forgotten how to let go of the day's concerns and surrender to the restorative wisdom of rest. The first visitor to arrive was a young man named Alexander Stormthought, whose mind raced with the speed of modern life, but had lost the ability to slow down when darkness fell. He appeared in Seraphina's space as someone running even while sitting still, his thoughts darting between tomorrow's meetings, yesterday's mistakes, and the endless list of tasks that seemed to multiply like seeds scattered in fertile soil. "Welcome, restless traveler," Seraphina spoke with a voice like water moving over smooth stones. "I see you carry the day's momentum into the night's threshold." Alexander looked around, confused by his surroundings, yet somehow not alarmed. "I don't understand how I got here. I was lying in bed trying to sleep, but my mind won't stop." "Your mind believes it must solve all things before it can rest," Seraphina observed gently. but the threshold teaches us that some gates open only when we stop pushing. She gestured to a path that seemed to materialize from mist and moonlight. Walk with me, and let us discover what your hurried thoughts are truly seeking. As they strolled along the ethereal pathway, Alexander found that his frantic mental pace began to match the rhythm of their slow, deliberate steps. The thoughts that had seemed so urgent moments before started to settle like snow coming to rest on still water. "I have so much to accomplish," he said, though with less urgency than before. "There's always more to do, more to worry about, more to fix." "Tell me," Serafina asked, pausing beside a fountain that flowed upward like liquid light. "When you accomplish one task, does the feeling of completion last?" Alexander considered this. "No, there's always something else immediately demanding my attention." "Then perhaps the accomplishment is not what you truly seek." She dipped her hand into the flowing light, and when she lifted it, luminous droplets fell upward, dissolving into starlight. "Perhaps what you seek is the peace that you believe accomplishment will bring. But peace is not earned through doing, it is remembered through being." As she spoke, Alexander felt something profound shift within him. The tight knot of urgency that had lived in his chest for months began to loosen. He realized that he had been chasing the feeling of enoughness through external achievements, never recognizing that enoughness was his natural state when he stopped trying so hard to prove his worth. While Alexander learned the art of being rather than doing, another visitor arrived in Serafina's realm. This was Miriam Gentleheart, an elderly woman whose sleep had been disturbed not by anxiety, but by a deep sadness that seemed to have no clear source. She manifested in the threshold space, sitting on a bench that overlooked a lake of liquid starlight, her shoulders curved inward as if protecting something precious and fragile. Serafina approached with the reverence one shows to someone carrying invisible wounds. "You honor this space with your presence, keeper of sorrows. What heavy beauty do you carry into the night?" Miriam looked up with eyes that held the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades. "I don't know why I feel so sad lately. My life has been good, my family loves me, my health is reasonable for my age. Yet, when night comes, this melancholy rises like fog from some hidden place." "Ah," Serafina nodded with deep understanding. "You carry what I call the sacred sadness grief, not for any specific loss, but for the beautiful impermanence of all things. It is the heart's way of loving so deeply that it mourns the very passage of time that makes each moment precious." She sat beside Miriam on the bench, and together they watched the starlight lake pulse gently with rhythms that matched the eternal heartbeat of the universe. This sadness is not something to cure, but something to befriend. It is the price and privilege of a heart that has remained open to beauty, despite knowing that all beautiful things are temporary. As Miriam listened, she felt a profound shift in her relationship to the melancholy that had been visiting her nights. Instead of fighting it or feeling guilty about it, she began to recognize it as a form of love. Her soul's way of honoring the preciousness of existence by feeling deeply the poignant beauty of impermanence. The lake before them seemed to respond to this recognition, its surface becoming perfectly still, reflecting not just the impossible stars above, but also the quiet radiance that was emerging from Miriam's newly peaceful heart. Throughout the threshold realm, other visitors arrived and departed, each finding exactly what they needed to make peace with sleep. There was Jonathan Quietstorm, whose perfectionism had turned bedtime into another performance to be mastered, and Elena Gentleriver, whose empathic nature absorbed the day's emotional residue from everyone she encountered. For Jonathan, Serafina created a space where imperfection was not just acceptable but beautiful, a garden where flowers grew in delightfully crooked patterns and where the most stunning sunset appeared painted with deliberately uneven brushstrokes. For Elena, she provided a cleansing ritual involving a waterfall of pure compassion that washed away the emotional debris she had unconsciously collected from others, leaving her own authentic feelings clear and recognizable. As dawn approached in the waking world, Serafina's visitors began their final transition from the threshold space into natural healing sleep. Alexander found himself back in his bedroom, but something fundamental had changed. The racing thoughts that had plagued him were still present, but they no longer controlled him. He had learned to be the spacious awareness that observed thoughts rather than the thoughts themselves. Miriam returned to her own bed with a new relationship to her nighttime sadness. Instead of seeing it as a problem to solve, she now recognized it as a friend who brought messages about the depth of her own capacity for love and presence. Each visitor carried with them a gift from the threshold realm, not a solution to their sleep difficulties, but a profound shift in their relationship to the transition between waking and sleeping. They had learned that the gateway to rest opens not through force or technique, but through a fundamental acceptance of their own humanity. Serafina remained in her liminal dwelling as the first light of dawn touched the edges of consciousness. Her work was never finished, for each night brought new souls who had forgotten how to cross peacefully from the concerns of day into the healing sanctuary of sleep. She prepared her space for the next evening's visitors, knowing that somewhere in the waking world, those she had served that night were now sleeping more deeply than they had in months. Their dreams filled with the gentle wisdom they had discovered at the threshold of letting go. Story 4: The Whisperer of Forgotten Peace. In a small coastal town where the rhythm of waves had counted time for longer than human memory, there lived a lighthouse keeper named Oceanus Stillwater, whose beacon served a purpose far different from guiding ships to safety. His light reached not across the physical waters of the harbor, but into the restless depths of human consciousness, offering guidance to souls lost in the storms of their own making. The lighthouse itself stood on a rocky promontory that jutted into the sea like a finger, pointing toward infinite possibility. Its structure was ancient, built from stones that had been polished by countless tides and windows that had witnessed generations of sunrises and storms. But under Oceanus's care, it had become something more than a navigational aid. It had become a sanctuary for those who had forgotten how to find their way to inner peace. Oceanus had discovered his unique gift quite by accident 3 years earlier, during the worst storm the coast had experienced in decades. As winds howled and waves crashed against the lighthouse with the fury of nature unleashed, he noticed something extraordinary happening in the beacon room. The rotating light, which should have been casting its beam across the turbulent waters, seemed to be drawing something toward it. Instead, not ships in distress, but the troubled thoughts and restless energies of people throughout the coastal region. That night, as he maintained his vigil at the light's controls, Oceanus felt the collective insomnia of hundreds of souls washing over him like waves against the shore. There was the anxious mother, 3 towns over, pacing her kitchen while her newborn finally slept, her mind spinning with worries about every aspect of her child's future. There was the fisherman's widow who hadn't slept peacefully since her husband was lost at sea, her nights filled with the phantom sound of storm winds and crashing waves. Instead of being overwhelmed by this influx of restless energy, Oceanus found that his years of solitary lighthouse keeping had prepared him for exactly this moment. He had learned to be still in the center of storms, both meteorological and emotional. His consciousness had become like the lighthouse itself, steady grounded and capable of offering guidance without being swept away by the chaos around it. On this particular evening, as autumn mist rolled in from the ocean and the first stars appeared through breaking clouds, Oceanus prepared for another night of his quiet service. He climbed the spiral stairs to the beacon room, his footsteps echoing in the familiar rhythm that had become a form of walking meditation over the years. The lighthouse beam began its slow rotation, but tonight it carried an unusual luminescence, a soft, pearl-like glow that seemed to extend far beyond its normal range. Oceanus had learned not to question these variations in the light's behavior. He understood that his lighthouse had become a living thing, responsive to the needs of those who required its unique form of guidance. As the beam swept across the darkening waters, it carried with it what Oceanus had come to think of as whispers of forgotten peace, gentle reminders of the natural state of calm that lived within every human heart, waiting to be remembered rather than achieved. The first person to be touched by tonight's beacon was a woman named Cassandra Nightwatch, who lived in a cottage overlooking the harbor. She had been a nurse for 25 years, dedicating her life to caring for others, but somewhere along the way, she had forgotten how to care for herself. Her nights had become extensions of her workdays, filled with mental checklists of patients' needs and procedures to remember. As the lighthouse beam swept past her bedroom window, Cassandra felt something shift in the quality of her restlessness. The urgent thoughts that usually commandeered her attention began to settle like sediment in a glass of water that had been still long enough for clarity to return. She found herself drawn to her window, where she could see the lighthouse beacon making its steady rotation against the star-filled sky. Without understanding why, she began to breathe in rhythm with the light's movement, inhaling as it swept toward her, exhaling as it moved away. This simple synchronization seemed to unlock something she had forgotten about the natural rhythm of rest and renewal. For the first time in months, Cassandra allowed herself to simply be present with the night rather than fighting it. She remembered that healing happened not only through action, but through the deep rest that allowed the body and soul to repair themselves. As this remembrance settled into her consciousness, her breathing deepened and her muscles began to release the tension they had been holding like armor against the world's pain. Meanwhile, the lighthouse beam continued its rotation, touching the consciousness of others who needed its gentle guidance. There was Marcus Oceanheart, a retired sea captain whose dreams had been haunted by storms. He could have navigated better decisions he could have made differently, harbors he should have reached sooner. The beam found Marcus sitting on his back porch, staring at the water that had been both his livelihood and his source of deepest regret. As the light touched him, he felt the weight of his self-criticism begin to lift. The lighthouse seemed to whisper without words that every captain makes the best decisions possible with the information available at the time, and that wisdom comes not from perfection, but from the courage to keep navigating despite the inevitable storms. In the beam's gentle illumination, Marcus began to see his career not as a series of mistakes to regret, but as a journey of learning and service. He had brought countless vessels safely to port, had rescued crews from troubled waters, had served as a bridge between the sea's power and humanity's need to traverse it. The storms he remembered so painfully had taught him lessons that made him a better captain, a more compassionate leader, a wiser human being. As this perspective settled into his heart, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Gratitude for the full spectrum of his maritime life, including the difficult parts that had shaped his character and deepened his understanding of both the sea's power and his own resilience. The lighthouse continued its work throughout the night, its beam reaching souls far inland who needed reminding of the ocean's ancient wisdom about flow and rhythm. There was Isabella Quiet-Tide, a librarian whose perfectionism had turned her peaceful workplace into a source of stress, and David Stormcalm, a young father whose love for his children had become entangled with worry about providing them with a perfect childhood. For Isabella, the beam carried the message of the ocean's vast acceptance, how it embraces all rivers, regardless of their size or clarity, how it supports all vessels without judgment of their design or destination. She began to understand that her library could be a place of sanctuary, not because everything was perfectly organized, but because it was filled with the generous intention to serve all who entered. For David, the lighthouse whispered the truth that waves had always known, that the most powerful force in shaping coastlines is not the dramatic storm, but the consistent, gentle touch of ordinary tides. His children would be shaped not by grand gestures of perfect parenting, but by the steady presence of love, offered moment by moment, day by day. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, Oceanus felt the familiar sense of completion that marked the end of his nocturnal service. One by one, those touched by the lighthouse beam had found their way to the peace that had always existed within them, waiting like a harbor in the storm of their own thoughts. He descended the spiral stairs with the satisfaction of a gardener who has tended seeds, knowing that growth happens in its own time and season. The lighthouse beam returned to its normal intensity, resuming its traditional role of guiding ships through the physical waters of the harbor. But throughout the coastal region, people were sleeping more deeply than they had in months. Their dreams filled with the sound of gentle waves and the comforting knowledge that, like the lighthouse itself, there are sources of guidance and peace that continue their work even when we cannot see them clearly. Story 5. The Collector of Wandering Thoughts. In the heart of an ancient forest where trees grew so tall they seemed to brush against the belly of the sky, there lived a peculiar being known as Lysander Thoughtcatcher, whose cottage existed in a clearing that could only be found by those whose minds were too restless to sleep. The dwelling itself appeared to be built from crystallized silence, its walls shimmering with an opalescent quality that seemed to absorb sound and transform it into visible peace. Lysander's appearance was as unique as his dwelling, tall and willowy, like the forest birches with hair that moved constantly, as if stirred by invisible breezes, and eyes that held the deep stillness of woodland pools. His most remarkable feature, however, was his ability to see the thoughts of others as they actually were, living entities with their own shapes, colors, and movements that danced around people's heads like visible music. The forest around Lysander's cottage was unlike any other woodland on earth. The trees here had grown in response to centuries of absorbing restless human thoughts, their branches reaching toward the sky in graceful spirals that seemed to dance even in the stillest air. Flowers bloomed in colors that corresponded to different emotional states: deep blue for worry, silver for confusion, golden yellow for the joy that emerges when the mind finally finds peace. Lysander had discovered his gift during childhood when he realized that other people couldn't see the swirling clouds of thoughts that surrounded every human head like personal weather systems. What began as a source of confusion and isolation eventually became his greatest tool for service, as he learned to help others understand the nature of their own mental patterns. Tonight, as moonlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted like thoughts themselves, Lysander sensed the approach of someone whose mind was particularly turbulent. Through the forest paths that existed only for those who needed them, a woman named Penelope Stormwind was making her way toward his clearing, though she had no conscious knowledge of her destination. Penelope was a city dweller, a successful architect whose creativity had become trapped beneath layers of deadline pressure and perfectionist expectations. For months, her sleep had been fractured by an endless parade of design problems, client concerns, and the relentless voice in her head that insisted she could never do enough, be enough, or create enough to justify her existence. As she emerged into Lysander's clearing, her thoughts were visible to him as a chaotic swirl of geometric shapes in harsh colors, sharp triangles of criticism cutting through soft circles of original ideas, rigid squares of obligation, crushing delicate spirals of creative inspiration. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking, like watching a master painter's work being continuously erased by an anxious hand. "Welcome, architect of possibilities," Lysander spoke with a voice like wind through leaves. "I see you carry a great storm of creation within you, but the winds blow in too many directions at once." Penelope looked around the clearing in wonder, though she couldn't quite remember how she had arrived here. The crystalline cottage seemed to pulse gently with its own inner light, and the air itself felt different, cleaner somehow, as if it had been filtered through layers of peace. "I don't understand," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had been running on nervous energy for too long. "I was lying in bed trying to sleep, and then I was walking through a forest I've never seen before." "The forest finds those who need it," Lysander explained, gesturing toward a circle of smooth stones that formed natural seats around a fire pit where flames danced without consuming any fuel. "Your thoughts have been wandering so far from home that they forgot the way back to rest. Perhaps it is time to gather them and show them the path to peace." As Penelope sat on one of the stone seats, she felt something remarkable happening to the mental chaos that had been her constant companion for months. The swirling thoughts that Lysander could see so clearly began to slow their frantic movement, drawn by the profound stillness that emanated from the cottage and its inhabitant. "Tell me about your creations," Lysander said, settling across from her with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to move in harmony with the forest's rhythms. "What do you build when your mind is quiet?" Penelope found herself describing architectural visions she had almost forgotten. Buildings that seemed to grow from the earth like living things, spaces designed not just for function, but for the nourishment of the human spirit. As she spoke, Lysander could see her thoughts beginning to change color and form the harsh angles, softening into flowing curves, the aggressive reds and oranges warming into gentle golds and greens. "Your true gift," he observed, "is not in forcing structures into existence, but in listening to what wants to be built. Every building has its own soul waiting to be discovered rather than imposed." This simple statement caused a profound shift in Penelope's awareness. She realized that her creative struggles came not from lack of ability, but from trying to control the creative process instead of partnering with it. The buildings that brought her the most joy were always the ones where she had learned to step back and let the design emerge from the interplay of sight function and intuition. While Penelope was discovering the difference between creating from force and creating from flow, another presence entered the clearing. This was Dr. Edmund Quietmind, a retired physician whose nights had been haunted by the accumulated weight of medical decisions made over a 40-year career. Lysander could see Edmund's thoughts as a complex web of interconnected memories, each one pulsing with the emotional residue of lives saved and lost diagnoses made, and missed the endless responsibility of holding others' well-being in human hands. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity, but exhausting in its density, like a tapestry woven so tightly that no light could pass through. "Healer of bodies," Lysander acknowledged as Edmund took his place in the circle. "You carry the stories of thousands within your memory. No wonder sleep eludes you. Your mind has become a library with too many books and too few shelves." Edmund nodded wearily. "I retired 2 years ago thinking I could finally rest, but every night I relive cases from decades past, wondering if I made the right decisions, if I could have done more, if I truly served those who trusted me with their lives." "The mind of a healer," Lysander said gently, "is like a garden that continues growing even after the gardener has laid down his tools. Each patient you treated planted seeds of care within your consciousness. These seeds have grown into trees of wisdom, but you have been so focused on the shadows they cast that you have forgotten to appreciate the shade they provide." As he spoke, Lysander gestured toward the trees surrounding them, their branches intertwining in patterns that seemed to mirror the connections between Edmund's memories. "See how each tree stands alone, yet contributes to the forest. Each patient you treated was both an individual healing and part of a larger pattern of service that extends far beyond any single decision." Edmund began to see his career not as a series of isolated moments of success or failure, but as a continuous thread in the vast tapestry of human caring. Every choice he had made, even the ones that led to outcomes he regretted, had been made with the best intentions and the best knowledge available at the time. Throughout the night, other wanderers found their way to Lysander's clearing. There was Maria Gentlestream, a teacher whose perfectionism had turned her love of education into a source of constant self-criticism, and Samuel Quietbrook, a widower whose grief had become so familiar that he was afraid to let it go, fearing that releasing his pain would mean forgetting his beloved wife. For each visitor, Lysander provided exactly what their wandering thoughts needed. Not solutions or advice, but a different way of seeing the patterns that had trapped them. He showed Maria that her teaching was most effective when she embraced the beautiful imperfection of learning, and he helped Samuel understand that healing from grief didn't mean forgetting love, but learning to carry it in a way that brought joy rather than suffering. As dawn approached, the clearing began to fill with a gentle luminescence that seemed to emanate from the thoughts themselves. Penelope's architectural visions now appeared as flowing structures of light. Edmund's medical memories had organized themselves into a wise and compassionate constellation, and each visitor's mental patterns had found their own natural harmony. Lysander rose from his stone seat as the first bird songs began to echo through the forest. "The thoughts that brought you here have remembered their way home to peace," he said. "When you return to your ordinary world, you will find that sleep comes more easily to minds that have learned to move with natural rhythms rather than against them." One by one, the visitors began to fade from the clearing, returning to their physical bodies and their own beds. But they carried with them something precious, the deep knowing that their restless thoughts were not enemies to be defeated, but wild creatures that needed patient guidance back to the stillness from which all thoughts emerge and to which they eventually return. Lysander remained in his clearing as the forest awakened around him, tending the fire that burned without fuel and preparing for the next night's gathering of wandering minds. He understood that thoughts, like all living things, needed both freedom to move and a safe place to rest, and he was honored to provide sanctuary for those who had forgotten how to find peace within the beautiful chaos of their own consciousness. Story 6. The Weaver of Transition Moments. At the edge of all endings and the beginning of all beginnings, in a space that existed neither fully in time nor completely outside it, there dwelt a mysterious figure known as Kronos Gentleweave, whose task was to help souls navigate the delicate passages between one phase of existence and another. Her workshop was located in what she called the eternal moment, that infinitesimal space between heartbeats where transformation becomes possible. The workshop itself defied ordinary description, appearing as different combinations of elements depending on what each visitor needed most. Sometimes it manifested as a cozy attic filled with bolts of fabric that shimmered with the essence of memories. Other times it appeared as a vast garden where flowers bloomed and faded in accelerated cycles, demonstrating the beauty found in impermanence. Kronos herself was a being of fluid grace, her appearance shifting subtly like candlelight, never quite the same from one moment to the next, yet somehow always perfectly familiar. Her hair moved as if stirred by gentle breezes that carried whispers from both past and future, and her eyes held the profound compassion that comes only to those who have witnessed countless souls learning to release what no longer serves them. Her work focused on those who found themselves trapped between life phases, unable to fully let go of what was ending but not yet ready to embrace what was beginning. These transition times, she understood, were when the soul was most vulnerable, and when sleep often became elusive, as consciousness struggled to navigate the uncertain terrain between familiar identity and unknown possibility. Tonight, as the workshop hummed with the subtle energy of transformation, Kronos sensed the approach of someone whose life was caught in a particularly challenging transition. Through pathways that existed only in the spaces between moments, a man named Theodore Driftkeeper was making his way toward her sanctuary. though he moved through his own dreams rather than any physical landscape. Theodore had recently retired after 37 years as a high school principal, a role that had defined not just his career, but his entire sense of identity. For decades, his days had been filled with the purposeful chaos of adolescent energy, the satisfaction of watching young minds discover their potential, and the meaningful challenge of creating an environment where learning could flourish. Now at 65, he found himself in a vast emptiness where purpose once lived. His days felt formless, his nights restless with the anxiety of someone who no longer knew how to introduce himself to the world. Sleep had become a battleground where his mind wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Who was he without his professional identity? What was his value without the daily confirmation of usefulness? How could he find meaning in a life that no longer had clear structure or obvious purpose? As Theodore entered Kronos' workshop through the doorway of his own deepening sleep, he found himself in a space that appeared to be an enormous loom stretched between earth and sky. Threads of every conceivable color and texture hung in the air around him, some glowing with the warm light of completed experiences, others shimmering with the potential of possibilities yet to be explored. Welcome, builder of young futures. Kronos greeted him with a voice that carried the gentle authority of someone who had overseen countless transformations. I see you stand at the loom of your own becoming, uncertain which threads to weave into the pattern of your next chapter. Theodore looked around in wonder at the infinite array of possibilities surrounding him. Some threads pulsed with memories of his teaching career. The satisfaction of watching a struggling student suddenly understand a concept. The pride of seeing graduates return years later to share their successes, the deep fulfillment that came from knowing his work had mattered. Other threads shimmered with potential futures he had never allowed himself to imagine. Perhaps the novel he had always wanted to write, the garden he could finally tend with patience and presence, the volunteer work that could channel his educational passion into new forms of service. I don't know how to choose, Theodore admitted, his voice carrying the vulnerability of someone facing an identity crisis in the second half of life. For so many years, my purpose was clear. Now I feel like I'm floating in an ocean without coordinates. Kronos moved among the threads with practiced grace, her fingers touching various strands and causing them to resonate with subtle harmonies. The art of life transitions, she explained, is not in choosing the perfect thread, but in understanding that every thread you've already woven has prepared you for this moment of conscious creation. She gestured toward a section of the loom where Theodore's professional threads formed an intricate pattern. See how your years of education created not just a career, but a deep understanding of human potential, a patience for gradual growth, and a wisdom about nurturing development in others. These qualities are not retired when you leave your position. They are gifts that seek new expressions. As Kronos spoke, Theodore began to see his career not as something that had ended, but as something that had prepared him for a different kind of service. His understanding of learning and growth, his ability to see potential in others, his skills in creating environments where people could flourish, all of these remained available to him, waiting to be woven into new patterns of contribution. While Theodore was discovering the continuity hidden within transition, another presence arrived in the workshop. This was Dr. Marina Stormcalm, a surgeon whose hands had been forced into retirement by arthritis ending a career that had defined her since medical school. Marina's arrival created a different energy in the workshop. The threads around her seemed to vibrate with the precision and intensity of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions with split-second timing. But there was also a deep sadness in her pattern, the grief of someone whose identity had been built around capabilities she could no longer access. Healer of bodies, Kronos acknowledged. Your hands may no longer hold the scalpel, but they carry within them the memory of every life you've touched. Skill such as yours is never truly lost. It simply transforms into wisdom that can guide others toward their own healing abilities. Marina looked at her hands swollen and stiff with arthritis and saw them for the first time, not as broken tools, but as repositories of experience and knowledge that could serve in entirely new ways. She began to envision herself not as a failed surgeon, but as a mentor who could help young doctors develop not just technical skills, but the deeper qualities of presence and compassion that made healing possible. Throughout the night, other souls found their way to Kronos' workshop. There was Elena Quiethaven, a mother whose last child had left for college, leaving her to rediscover who she was beyond her role as caregiver, and Robert Gentlecurrent, a widower learning to create meaning in a life that had been centered around partnership for 43 years. For each visitor, Kronos demonstrated the same profound truth that transitions are not endings followed by beginnings, but continuous weavings, where the threads of past experience become the foundation for future creation. She showed them how to see retirement not as cessation, but as graduation to new forms of service. How to understand empty nests not as loss, but as liberation into unexplored possibilities. As dawn approached in the ordinary world, the workshop began to pulse with a gentle rhythm that matched the universal heartbeat of transformation. Each visitor had discovered something essential about their own transition process, that identity is not a fixed thing to be lost, but a flowing river that takes new forms while maintaining its essential nature. Theodore found himself standing before a section of the loom where his educational threads were beginning to weave themselves into new patterns of possibility. He could see potential futures where his love of learning might express itself through writing, mentoring, or creating community programs that brought together different generations. Marina saw her surgical precision transforming into the ability to make precise cuts in confusion, helping other healthcare professionals find clarity in the chaos of modern medicine. Her hands might no longer perform surgery, but they could hold space for healing in ways she was only beginning to imagine. Kronos watched with satisfaction as each visitor began to understand that they were not victims of life's changes, but active participants in their own transformation. The workshop filled with a warm light that seemed to emanate from the loom itself as new patterns of possibility began to take shape. "Remember," she said, as her visitors prepared to return to their sleeping bodies, transition is not about becoming someone new, but about becoming more fully who you have always been. Every ending is pregnant with beginnings that honor the wisdom of what came before while embracing the mystery of what is yet to emerge. One by one, they faded from the workshop, returning to their beds with a new understanding of their life transitions. They would wake the next morning with a sense of possibility they hadn't felt in months, carrying within them the knowledge that identity is not a possession to be lost, but a creative process to be continued. Kronos remained in her workshop as the eternal moment stretched itself around her, preparing for the next group of souls who would need guidance through the beautiful complexity of human transformation. She understood that her work was never finished, for consciousness itself is always in transition, always weaving new patterns from the threads of experience and possibility. Story 7. The Keeper of Sacred Ordinary Moments. In a small village that existed in the space between extraordinary and mundane, where every ordinary action carried the potential for profound realization, there lived a baker named Serenity Breadweaver, whose shop served as an unexpected sanctuary for souls who had lost their ability to find wonder in the simple acts of daily life. Serenity's bakery occupied the ground floor of a building that seemed to have grown from the village square itself, its stone walls weathered to a warm honey color that glowed softly in both morning sunlight and evening candlelight. The windows were large and welcoming, always revealing the gentle activity within kneading, rising, baking that followed rhythms older than any clock or calendar. What made Serenity's establishment truly special was not the exceptional quality of her bread, though that was certainly remarkable, but her unique ability to help people rediscover the profound peace that lives hidden within the most ordinary activities. She had learned through years of solitary baking in the pre-dawn hours that consciousness could be transformed not through dramatic spiritual practices, but through bringing complete presence to the simple tasks that filled every human day. The bakery itself seemed to exist slightly outside normal time. Customers often entered intending to quickly purchase their daily bread, only to find themselves lingering for hours watching Serenity work with the unhurried grace of someone who had discovered that haste was the enemy of both good bread and inner peace. Tonight, as the village settled into its evening rhythm, Serenity was preparing for what she called her midnight practice, a form of bread making that she performed not for the next day's customers, but for the healing of souls whose sleep had been disturbed by the modern disease of finding life insufficiently meaningful. As she moved through her bakery in the gentle lamplight, arranging ingredients with the reverence of a monk preparing for prayer, Serenity could sense the restless energy of those whose nights had been claimed by the persistent feeling that their lives lacked significance. These were people who had convinced themselves that meaning could only be found in extraordinary achievements, missing entirely the profound depths available in each moment of ordinary existence. Her awareness was drawn first to a woman named Catherine Rushwater, who lived in the apartment above the village bookstore and had spent the past 3 hours lying awake, consumed by the belief that her life as a librarian was somehow insufficient. Catherine's mind churned with comparisons to friends who had achieved more visible success, regrets about opportunities not taken, and a deep anxiety that she was wasting her one precious life in pursuits too small to matter. Without leaving her bakery, Serenity began to work with an intention that connected her directly to Catherine's restless consciousness. She measured flour with the precision of someone who understood that every grain mattered not because perfection was required, but because attention itself was a form of love. As Serenity's hands moved through the familiar motions of bread making, Catherine felt something shifting in her restless mental landscape. The frantic thoughts that had been cycling through her mind began to slow, drawn by some invisible force toward a different way of seeing her daily work. Serenity mixed water into flour with the gentle persistence of rain-nourishing earth. And somehow, Catherine began to remember moments of profound connection she had experienced in her library. The teenager who discovered a love of poetry through a book she recommended, the elderly man who found comfort in the quiet space during his wife's final illness, the countless small acts of service that had created ripples of beauty in ways she had never fully recognized. As the dough began to form under Serenity's patient hands, Catherine's understanding of her own life began to transform. She started to see that significance was not about the size of one's impact, but about the quality of presence brought to each moment of service. Her work with books was not a small thing, but a sacred trust. She was a guardian of human wisdom, a facilitator of the connections between seeking minds and transformative ideas. While Catherine was discovering the profound meaning hidden within her ordinary days, Serenity's awareness expanded to encompass another restless soul. This was Marcus Gentletask, a janitor at the local hospital whose nights had become haunted by the feeling that his work was invisible and therefore worthless. Marcus spent his days cleaning spaces where life and death decisions were made, maintaining environments where healing happened, ensuring that doctors and nurses could focus on their important work without distraction. Yet, somewhere along the way, he had absorbed the cultural message that only certain types of work carried dignity and meaning. Serenity began to knead her dough with the rhythmic patience of ocean waves shaping coastlines, and through this motion she sent an invisible teaching toward Marcus's troubled sleep. As her hands worked the bread pressing and folding with gentle strength, Marcus began to understand that his work was not separate from the hospital's healing mission, but integral to it. Every floor he mopped became a foundation for medical miracles. Every surface he cleaned became a space where families could gather without worry about contamination. Every hallway he maintained became a pathway where hope could walk safely toward its destination. His work was not invisible. It was the essential background that allowed everything else to function with grace and safety. As Serenity shaped her dough into loaves, Marcus felt his own sense of purpose reshaping itself. He began to see that all work performed with care and attention was sacred work, that service did not require recognition to be valuable, and that the most important contributions were often the ones that allowed others to shine. Throughout the night, Serenity's bread-making reached other souls whose sleep had been disrupted by the modern epidemic of meaninglessness. There was Elena Quiet Service, a postal worker who had forgotten that she was a daily link in the vast network of human connection, and David Gentlecreate, an accountant who had lost sight of how his attention to detail helped others achieve their dreams and security. For each of these seeking souls, Serenity's practice offered the same profound teaching that ordinary work performed with extraordinary presence becomes a form of meditation, that service of any kind connects us to the vast web of interdependence that sustains all life. And that meaning is not something to be achieved, but something to be recognized in what we are already doing. As her loaves went into the oven, filling the bakery with the ancient aroma that had comforted humanity for millennia, Serenity felt the shift that always marked the deepest part of her practice. The bread was no longer just bread, but a symbol of transformation, flour and water and yeast, becoming something that could nourish both body and soul. Catherine, in her bed above the bookstore, felt a profound peace settle over her as she finally understood that her life was not too small, but perfectly sized for the love she was meant to share. Marcus, in his simple apartment near the hospital, drifted into the deepest sleep he had experienced in months. His dreams filled with the satisfaction of work well done and purpose clearly seen. As dawn approached, Serenity removed her loaves from the oven, their golden crusts singing softly as they cooled in the morning air. She knew that when her customers arrived for their daily bread, they would taste not just the skill of her hands, but the intention of her heart, the deep understanding that every ordinary moment contains infinite possibilities for grace. The bakery filled with the warm light of sunrise, and Serenity began preparing for another day of serving both bread and the more subtle nourishment of helping others remember that their lives exactly as they were contained all the meaning they could ever need. She understood that her midnight practice was both utterly ordinary and completely miraculous, the simple act of making bread with total presence, offered in service of souls who had forgotten how to find the sacred in the everyday rhythms of human existence. Story 8. The Guardian of Lost Silences. In the heart of a bustling metropolis, where the constant symphony of urban noise had driven most people to forget what true silence felt like, there existed a hidden sanctuary known only to those whose souls were starving for the deep peace that lives in the spaces between sounds. This refuge was tended by a mysterious figure called Quietus Stillheart, whose gift was the ability to collect and preserve the rare silences that the modern world was rapidly losing. Quietus's sanctuary was located in a seemingly impossible space, a pocket of profound stillness that existed between the floors of a towering office building, accessible only through a door that appeared to those who had reached the point where noise had become a form of suffering. The space itself defied the laws of physics, feeling vast and intimate, simultaneously filled with the most precious collection on earth, actual silence. The walls of the sanctuary were lined with what appeared to be empty glass vessels of various sizes, but each one contained a different quality of silence that Quietus had rescued from the disappearing quiet places of the world. There was the silence of snow falling on an empty field, the silence of a library at dawn, the silence that follows a baby's first cry, and the profound silence that exists in the moment between a question and its answer. Quietus himself was a being who seemed to be made partially of silence itself. His movements created no sound. His presence added weight to quietude rather than disturbing it. And his eyes held the deep peace that comes only to those who have learned to listen to the spaces between words rather than the words themselves. Tonight, as the city's cacophony reached its peak in the hours when most people struggled to find rest amidst the urban symphony, Quietus sensed several souls whose desperate need for silence was creating a kind of psychic cry that only he could hear. These were people for whom the constant noise of modern life had become not just irritating, but actually toxic, poisoning their ability to access the inner stillness that all humans need for psychological and spiritual health. The first to find his way to the sanctuary was a man named Benjamin Neushardt, a sound engineer who had spent so many years immersed in the technical manipulation of audio that he had lost the ability to appreciate natural quiet. His apartment overlooked a busy intersection. His work required him to spend hours each day in studios filled with complex soundscapes, and even his relaxation time was accompanied by podcasts, music, or television. Benjamin had reached the sanctuary through a dream pathway that opened only when the need for silence became urgent enough to overcome the mind's conditioning toward constant stimulation. As he stepped through the impossible door, the first thing he noticed was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something he had forgotten existed, the living quality of authentic quietude. "Welcome, shaper of sounds," Quietus spoke in a voice that somehow made the silence deeper rather than breaking it. "I see you carry the weight of too much listening without the relief of truly hearing." Benjamin looked around the sanctuary in amazement, his nervous system beginning to unwind for the first time in years. The constant tension he carried in his shoulders, the chronic tightness in his jaw from unconsciously bracing against noise, the subtle anxiety that had become his baseline state, all of it began to dissolve in the profound quiet of Quietus's collection. "I didn't realize how much I needed this," Benjamin admitted, his voice automatically dropping to a whisper in response to the sacred atmosphere. "I've been surrounded by sound for so long that I forgot silence was even possible." Quietus moved among his collection with the reverence of a curator in a museum of precious artifacts. He selected a particular vessel, one that contained what he called the silence of deep forests, and allowed a small portion of it to escape into the sanctuary. The quality of quiet immediately shifted, becoming richer, more alive, filled with the subtle presence of growing things and the patient wisdom of ancient trees. As this forest silence settled around him, Benjamin felt something profound happening to his consciousness. The constant internal noise that had been his mental soundtrack for years, the endless stream of analysis, planning, and mental music that never stopped playing, began to quiet. For the first time in recent memory, he experienced what it felt like to think one thought at a time, to have actual space between his mental processes. "Sound," Quietus explained as he carefully returned the forest silence to its vessel, "is meant to emerge from silence and return to silence. When we lose touch with the source, sound becomes noise, and noise becomes a form of suffering that prevents the soul from accessing its own natural peace." While Benjamin was rediscovering his relationship with quietude, another presence entered the sanctuary. This was Dr. Sarah, constantly a pediatric emergency room physician whose world was filled with the urgent sounds of medical crisis, alarms, codes, crying children, worried parents, and the constant underlying hum of life-saving equipment. Sarah had not slept peacefully in over a year. Even when she was at home, her nervous system remained hypervigilant, listening for sounds that might indicate emergency. Her mind had become like a radio that couldn't be turned off, constantly scanning for signals that might require her immediate attention. Quietus recognized the particular quality of exhaustion that Sarah carried, the bone-deep fatigue that comes not from physical exertion but from a nervous system that has forgotten how to rest. He selected a different vessel from his collection, one containing what he called the silence of healed hearts, and allowed its contents to flow gently through the sanctuary. This silence was different from the forest quiet. It carried the profound peace that exists after crisis has passed, after the emergency has been resolved, after the urgent need has been met. It was the silence of recovery, of systems returning to normal, of the deep exhale that follows successfully navigating danger. As this healing silence enveloped her, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since her residency. began the ability to be completely off duty. Her shoulders dropped from their perpetual position of readiness. Her breathing deepened beyond the shallow pattern that had become habitual, and for the first time in months, she was not listening for anything at all. The healer's burden, Quietus observed with infinite compassion, is that your openness to others' pain prevents you from accessing your own peace. This silence will remind your nervous system that it is safe to rest, that someone else can hold watch while you allow yourself to simply be. Throughout the night, other souls found their way to the sanctuary of lost silences. There was Marcus Alwason, a businessman whose life had become a continuous conference call, and Elena, overloaded, a mother of 3 whose home had become a constant symphony of children's needs, household demands, and the background noise of family life. For Marcus, Quietus offered the silence of mountaintops, the vast, clean quiet that exists above the noise of human activity, where perspective naturally returns and priorities reorganize themselves without effort. As this high-altitude silence filled the sanctuary, Marcus felt his mind clearing of the cluttered thinking that had been preventing him from seeing simple solutions to complex problems. For Elena, Quietus shared the silence of early morning, the precious quiet that exists before the day's demands begin, when the world is still full of potential rather than pressure. This pre-dawn silence reminded her that beneath her role as caregiver, she was still a complete person with her own needs for peace and reflection. As the night progressed, Quietus worked with each visitor to help them understand that silence was not the absence of sound, but the presence of spaciousness, the fertile void from which all meaningful activity emerges and to which it returns. He taught them that seeking silence was not about escaping life, but about finding the stillness that allows life to be lived with greater presence and joy. As dawn approached, the sanctuary began to fill with a different quality of light, not the harsh brightness of artificial illumination, but the gentle luminescence that comes from inner peace. Each visitor had been reunited with a part of themselves they had lost in the noise of modern existence. Benjamin returned to his dreams with the understanding that his work with sound could become a form of service, helping others find the balance between stimulation and rest. Sarah drifted into the deepest sleep she had experienced in years, her nervous system finally able to trust that it was safe to completely let go. Quietus remained in his sanctuary as the city awakened around him, tending his collection of preserved silences and preparing for the next group of souls who would need refuge from the overwhelming noise of contemporary life. He understood that his work was becoming increasingly important as the world grew louder and humans became more disconnected from the natural rhythms of sound and silence that had sustained their ancestors for millennia. Story 9: The Weaver of Forgotten Dreams. In the liminal space between memory and imagination, where the dreams that people had abandoned in pursuit of practical concerns went to wait for rediscovery, there lived a keeper of possibilities named Morpheus Dreamkeeper, whose workshop existed in the collective unconscious of humanity itself. Morpheus's workshop was unlike any physical space that could exist in the waking world. It appeared as a vast library where the books wrote themselves, their pages filled not with words, but with the living essence of dreams that had been set aside, postponed, or deemed too impractical for adult consideration. The shelves stretched infinitely upward, holding volumes that glowed softly with the unused potential of human aspirations. Each book contained a different dream that someone had once cherished: the novel that was never written, the garden that was never planted, the journey that was never taken, the song that was never sung. These dreams had not died, but had been carefully preserved by Morpheus, waiting for the moment when their dreamers would be ready to remember what they had forgotten they wanted. Morpheus himself was a figure of gentle authority, his appearance shifting between the various ages of human dreaming. Sometimes young, with the enthusiasm of infinite possibility, sometimes middle-aged, with the wisdom of experience, sometimes elderly, with the deep knowing that comes from witnessing countless dreams find their way to fulfillment. Tonight, as the workshop hummed with the subtle energy of dormant possibilities, Morpheus sensed the approach of someone whose soul was crying out for reconnection with dreams that had been buried beneath years of responsible living. Through pathways that existed only in the deepest layers of sleep, a woman named Victoria Practical Heart was making her way toward his sanctuary. Victoria had been a dreamer once. As a child, she had filled notebooks with stories, spent hours creating elaborate fantasy worlds, and believed with absolute certainty that she would grow up to be a writer whose words would touch hearts and change lives. But somewhere in the transition to adulthood, practical concerns had gradually eclipsed her creative aspirations. College had meant studying business rather than literature. Career meant climbing corporate ladders rather than exploring imaginative landscapes. Marriage and family meant financial responsibility took precedence over artistic expression. Each choice had seemed reasonable at the time, but collectively they had created a life that felt successful on the surface, yet hollow at its core. Now, at 45, Victoria found herself unable to sleep, peacefully haunted by a persistent sense that she had somehow missed her true calling. Her nights were filled with a vague but persistent longing for something she couldn't quite name. A life that felt more authentic, more aligned with who she had been before the world taught her to be practical. As Victoria entered Morpheus's workshop through the doorway of her own deepening sleep, she found herself surrounded by books that seemed to recognize her presence. One volume in particular began to glow with increasing intensity, drawing her attention like a beacon calling a lost traveler home. "Welcome, keeper of untold stories." Morpheus greeted her with a voice that carried the warmth of someone who had been waiting patiently for her arrival. "I see you have come to reclaim what was never truly lost, only temporarily set aside." Victoria approached the glowing book with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. As she opened it, the pages revealed not words but living scenes from her childhood. Herself, at age 8, writing her first story about a magical kingdom where everyone's dreams came true. Herself at 12, staying up late to finish a fantasy novel that existed only in her imagination. Herself at 16, winning a local writing contest and feeling for the first time that her words might actually matter to someone other than herself. "These are my dreams," she whispered, tears beginning to form. She recognized the passion that had once filled her young heart. "I had forgotten how much I loved this." "Dreams are never forgotten," Morpheus explained gently, settling beside her on a chair that materialized from the workshop's responsive environment. "They are simply covered over by the accumulated layers of what we believe we should want instead of what we actually want. But like seeds buried in winter soil, they wait patiently for the right conditions to grow again." As Victoria continued to explore the book of her abandoned dreams, she began to understand that her years in the business world had not been a betrayal of her creative nature, but a preparation for it. The communication skills she had developed, the understanding of human psychology she had gained, the life experiences she had accumulated, all of these could serve her writing in ways that would not have been possible if she had pursued her dreams directly from childhood. The practical life you built, Morpheus observed, was not a detour from your dreams, but a foundation for them. Your stories now have the depth that comes from living fully in the world, not just observing it from the safety of imagination. While Victoria was rediscovering her connection to her authentic dreams, another presence entered the workshop. This was Dr. James Forgotten Song, a successful cardiologist whose childhood dream of becoming a musician had been buried beneath decades of medical training and practice. James had been a gifted pianist as a child, spending hours at the keyboard creating melodies that seemed to emerge from some deep well of inspiration. His parents had been proud of his musical talent, but had encouraged him to pursue medicine as a more stable career. The piano had gradually become a piece of furniture rather than an instrument of expression, and the music that had once flowed through him so naturally had been reduced to occasional nostalgic moments when he heard a particularly moving piece. Morpheus guided James to his own book of forgotten dreams, where the pages revealed not musical notation, but the actual sound and feeling of the compositions he had never written. As James experienced these phantom melodies, he felt his heart opening to a part of himself that had been in hibernation for 30 years. The healing you offer as a physician, Morpheus suggested, and the healing you could offer as a musician are not separate callings, but aspects of the same gift. Your understanding of the human heart, both literal and metaphorical, could create music that touches souls in ways that medicine alone cannot reach. James began to see that his medical career had not been an abandonment of his musical dreams, but an education in the very human experiences that could give his music depth and authenticity. The suffering he had witnessed, the healing he had facilitated, the intimate moments of human vulnerability he had been privileged to observe. All of these could be transformed into musical expressions that offered comfort and inspiration to others. Throughout the night, other dreamers found their way to Morpheus's workshop. There was Maria Forgottenbrush, who had set aside her love of painting to focus on raising her family, and David Silent Poet, whose verses had been abandoned when he decided that poetry was too impractical for a man with financial responsibilities. For each visitor, Morpheus offered the same profound gift: the recognition that dreams are not luxuries to be indulged only after all practical concerns have been met, but essential nutrients for the soul that become more important, not less, as life progresses. He showed Maria that her years of motherhood had given her an understanding of color, light, and emotion that could infuse her paintings with a richness that her younger self could never have achieved. He helped David see that his experiences in the business world had given him insights into human nature that could make his poetry more accessible and meaningful to ordinary people struggling with ordinary challenges. As dawn approached, the workshop began to fill with a golden light that seemed to emanate from the books themselves. Each visitor had been reunited with dreams that had been waiting patiently for their return, and each was beginning to understand that it was never too late to begin again. Victoria closed her book of forgotten stories with a new understanding that she could begin writing immediately, not despite her practical career, but because of the wisdom it had given her. James felt his fingers remembering the feel of piano keys, his heart already composing melodies that would bridge the gap between healing and beauty. Morpheus watched with satisfaction as his visitors prepared to return to their sleeping bodies, carrying with them the renewed awareness that their authentic dreams were not relics of an impractical youth, but seeds of possibility that had been patiently waiting for the right season to bloom. "Remember," he said as they began to fade from the workshop, "dreams are not destinations to be reached, but directions to be followed. The journey towards your authentic expression is itself the fulfillment of the dream." One by one, they returned to their beds, but they carried with them something precious, the knowledge that their deepest aspirations were not foolish fantasies, but essential aspects of their souls that demanded expression. They would wake the next morning with a sense of possibility they hadn't felt in years, and many would take the first small steps toward reclaiming the dreams they had thought were lost forever. Morpheus remained in his workshop, tending the infinite library of human possibilities and preparing for the next group of souls who would need to remember that practical living and authentic dreaming were not opposites, but partners in the dance of a life fully lived. Story 10. The Keeper of Final Whispers. At the edge of all stories, where every narrative finds its way to completion and every soul discovers the profound peace that comes from understanding the perfect wholeness of their journey, there lived the final guardian of this cycle of healing tales. This was Sophia Completeheart, whose role was to help those who had forgotten that every life, regardless of its apparent struggles or imperfections, was already complete in its own mysterious way. Sophia's dwelling existed in a place that could only be described as the heart of completion itself, a space where all seeking naturally came to rest, where all questions found their answers not in new information, but in the profound acceptance of what had always been present. Her sanctuary appeared differently to each visitor, but always as the place they had been unconsciously seeking their entire lives. The architecture of her space defied description because it was built not from materials, but from the essence of fulfillment itself. Some experienced it as a garden where every flower had bloomed to perfect maturity, others as a library where every story had found its ideal ending, still others as a simple room with a single chair positioned to catch the most beautiful light they had ever seen. Sophia herself embodied the quality that all the previous guardians had been gently guiding their visitors toward the deep, knowing that life exactly as it was already perfect in its imperfection, already complete in its apparent incompleteness, already whole despite its visible brokenness. Tonight, as the final thread in this tapestry of healing stories, Sophia prepared to welcome those who had traveled through all the previous realms of transformation but still carried one last burden: the belief that their lives were somehow insufficient, unfinished, or falling short of what they were supposed to achieve. The first to arrive was a man named Gabriel Almos there, who had spent his entire adult life feeling like he was perpetually on the verge of finally understanding what his life was supposed to mean. He had sought meaning through career success, relationship fulfillment, spiritual practice, and creative expression, but no matter what he achieved, the feeling of almost but not quite persisted. Gabriel found himself in Sophia's sanctuary, as it appeared to him a vast observatory where he could see the entire story of his life laid out like constellations against the night sky. Each experience, each relationship, each success and failure glowed with its own light, connected to all the others in patterns of stunning beauty. "Welcome, seeker of completion." Sophia greeted him with a presence that somehow contained both infinite space and intimate warmth. "I see you have been searching for the moment when your life would finally make sense, not realizing that it has been making perfect sense all along." Gabriel looked up at the constellation of his life story, and for the first time, he could see the wholeness that had always been there but had been invisible to him while he was living it. Every apparent mistake had led to unexpected wisdom. Every loss had opened space for new forms of love. Every period of confusion had been followed by clarity that wouldn't have been possible without the confusion. "But I feel like I've wasted so much time," Gabriel protested, his voice carrying the weight of decades of self-criticism. "I've made so many wrong turns, missed so many opportunities, failed to become the person I thought I was supposed to be." Sophia gestured toward the constellation above them, where the so-called wrong turns appeared as essential curves in a pattern of breathtaking elegance. The story of a life is not measured by its efficiency, but by its authenticity. Every detour you took was actually the path itself, leading you to become exactly who you needed to be to offer your unique gifts to the world. As Gabriel continued to observe his life from this new perspective, he began to understand that completion was not something to be achieved in the future, but something to be recognized in the present moment. His life was already complete, not because it was perfect, but because it was his lived with the courage to keep growing and the wisdom to keep seeking. While Gabriel was discovering the completeness that had always existed within his apparent incompleteness, another presence entered Sophia's sanctuary. This was Dr. Elizabeth Neverenough, a humanitarian who had dedicated her life to helping others but could never escape the feeling that her efforts were insufficient in the face of the world's immense suffering. Elizabeth's version of the sanctuary appeared as a vast field where she could see every life she had touched, every person she had helped, every small act of service she had performed. But instead of seeing isolated good deeds surrounded by an ocean of unmet need, she saw a network of light that extended far beyond her ability to perceive each act of kindness, creating ripples that touched other lives, which in turn created their own ripples of positive change. "Healer of the world's pain," Sophia acknowledged, "you have been carrying the impossible burden of believing that your love should be able to eliminate all suffering. But love's true power lies not in its ability to prevent all pain, but in its capacity to transform pain into wisdom and compassion." Elizabeth watched as the network of light revealed how her work had influenced not just the people she had directly served, but countless others who had been inspired by her example, who had learned from those she had helped, who had been touched by the culture of caring she had helped create. Her individual efforts, which had always felt small against the magnitude of global need, were revealed as essential threads in a vast tapestry of healing that extended far beyond her ability to see. "I wanted to save everyone," Elizabeth admitted, tears flowing as she recognized both the beauty and the impossibility of her deepest motivation. "And in trying to save everyone, you have saved exactly who you were meant to save," Sophia replied with infinite gentleness. The completeness of your service lies not in reaching every person who needs help, but in offering your help with complete authenticity to those whose paths crossed yours. Throughout the night, other souls found their way to Sophia's sanctuary of completion. There was Thomas' imperfect father, who had spent years agonizing over his mistakes as a parent, and Rebecca Unfinished Song, who felt her life was incomplete because she had never found the romantic love she had always dreamed of. For Thomas, Sophia revealed how his imperfect parenting had actually given his children the gift of resilience, authenticity, and the knowledge that love doesn't require perfection. His struggles and mistakes had modeled for them that being human means continuing to grow and learn throughout life. For Rebecca, Sophia showed how her life without romantic partnership had allowed her to develop forms of love and service that would not have been possible within the constraints of traditional coupling. Her completeness existed not despite her singleness, but through the unique ways she had learned to love the world. As the night progressed toward dawn, each visitor began to understand the profound truth that Sophia embodied, that life was not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be received, not a test to be passed, but an experience to be lived fully, not a project to be completed, but a dance to be danced with presence and joy. Gabriel felt the chronic dissatisfaction that had driven him for decades finally dissolve, as he recognized that his seeking itself had been the point. Each moment of searching had been a moment of aliveness. Each period of confusion had been an opportunity for growth. Each experience of incompleteness had been an invitation to remain open to life's ongoing gifts. Elizabeth experienced a profound shift from the exhausting drive to fix everything to the sustainable joy of participating in the world's healing without needing to control its outcomes. Her work would continue, but from a place of completion rather than deficit service, rather than rescue. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate Sophia's sanctuary, she gathered all her visitors together in a circle that seemed to encompass not just them, but all the souls who had been touched by the healing stories that had preceded this moment. "You have journeyed through realms of transformation," Sophia said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed countless souls discover their own completeness. "You have learned to weave dreams and catch thoughts, to gather silence and tend transitions, to find meaning in ordinary moments and peace in imperfect circumstances. But the deepest healing comes from recognizing that you never needed to be healed. You needed only to remember that you were already whole." The sanctuary filled with a light that seemed to come from the visitors themselves, as each soul recognized the truth that had been hidden in plain sight throughout their entire lives, that their existence itself was the miracle, that their capacity to seek meant they had already found what they were looking for, that their ability to feel incomplete was itself proof of their profound completeness. One by one, they began to return to their sleeping bodies, but they carried with them something that would transform not just their nights, but their entire approach to living. They had discovered that the peace they sought in sleep was available in every moment, that the healing they hoped for in dreams was already present in their waking lives, that the wholeness they yearned for was not a destination to reach, but a recognition to embrace. Sophia remained in her sanctuary as the new day dawned, holding space for the endless cycle of souls who would continue to seek to struggle to grow and ultimately to discover that they had never been broken in the first place, only temporarily forgetful of their own infinite beauty. The 10 healing stories had reached their completion, not because every problem had been solved or every question answered, but because each tale had pointed toward the same profound truth that peace is not something to achieve, but something to remember, that healing is not something to pursue, but something to allow, and that the deepest rest comes not from the absence of struggle, but from the recognition that even our struggles are sacred expressions of our endless capacity to grow to love and to serve the mysterious wholeness of which we are all part. In bedrooms throughout the world, those who had been touched by these stories settled into the most peaceful sleep they had experienced in years, their dreams filled with the gentle wisdom they had discovered in the space between seeking and finding, between question and answer, between the restless mind and the eternally peaceful heart.